So now let's talk about instances that would be exempt from the competitive bidding process. Bids or proposals are required for all procurements except when certain circumstances apply. These include purchases made under New York State contracts through purchasing consortiums or through campus central stores or service centers. Purchases up to $200,000 with certified small businesses or with minority women-owned businesses also do not require bids. And finally, purchases that qualify as either sole source or single source procurements do not require bids or proposals, but do require adequate documentation.
Okay, so now let's take a couple of minutes to go over the difference between single and sole source procurements. Sole source procurements are purchases where the product or service being procured is unique to one source, or the requirements for the product or service can only be met by one supplier. An example would be the purchase of a component or replacement part for which there is no commercially available substitute and which can only be obtained from the manufacturer. An example of a sole source procurement is the purchase of equipment for which there is no comparable product, such as a one-of-a-kind oscilloscope that is available from only one supplier, or a micromanipulator that needs to go down to a certain scale. In these instances, the purchasing department would do an RFI, or request for information, to see if any companies sell that product. If only one company has the product, then it's a sole source procurement.
Single source procurements are purchases where there are two or more potential vendors, but it has been determined that it is in the best interest of the research foundation to procure from a particular vendor. An example of a single source procurement would be where a department needs maintenance for a specific piece of equipment, and that maintenance must be provided by a particular vendor to maintain the warranty. Emergency situations where it is not possible or practical to obtain bids would also qualify as single source procurements.
Both single and sole source procurements require adequate documentation of the solicitation elements that includes a clear and accurate description of the technical and programmatic requirements. This has been a hot topic in recent audits and can be a little painful up front, but can save a lot of headaches down the road if they are adequately documented. This next slide shows the recently revamped single sole source justification form, which is available on the RF portal. This form should be used for all purchases that exceed $50,000 where no competitive bids have been solicited or they are not available. The form requires the end user to check the appropriate justifications which exempt the procurement from formal competition. It also requires the user to provide a detailed justification and to elaborate on the circumstances that make the procurement exempt from competition. The end user is also required to provide a fair and/or reasonableness of price analysis that was used to determine whether the cost was reasonable. Once the form is completed, an authorized signer, which would be the PI or the campus operations manager or designee, will certify that the procurement does not violate the RF's conflict of interest policy. Once approved, the completed form should be maintained in the campus purchasing records. So just to summarize, the single sole source procurement process should only be used in special circumstances that we've discussed. Bridget, from a campus perspective, does your campus have any purchases that qualify as single or sole source procurements?
At our campus, single sole source procurements do occur, but they are rare. There are times when certain PIs do want to purchase something from a certain vendor, but we really need them to justify why they need that product from that particular vendor, and we need to be able to ensure that it can't be obtained from any other source.
Okay. Thanks, Bridget.
Sure.
Now let's discuss the requirements for bids and proposals when there aren't any circumstances involved that exempt the competitive bidding process. For procurements that are below $50,000, there is no requirement for solicitation of bids or proposals. However, if the same vendor is used repeatedly, the pricing and quality of services should be reviewed periodically. Purchases below the $50,000 threshold do require a fair or reasonableness of price analysis. This can be done by getting an online quote of a similar product or service or a verbal quote from another vendor. Historical costs of what was paid to other vendors for similar products or services is also sufficient to document that the cost is reasonable. For procurements greater than $50,000 and up to $100,000, They require a solicitation of bids or proposals and a selection from a minimum of 3 written or verbal quotes. For procurements of $100,000 and above, the 3 bids must be written.